Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Stage is a series on this channel where games are played in the Commander Tavern for your entertainment. On this episode of The Stage, we have a 3DH match between a Kozilek the Great Distortion eldrazi tribal deck piloted by Josué, a Varina Lich Queen zombie tribal deck piloted by Stephan, and a Sidisi brew Tyrant graveyard hijinks deck piloted by yours truly. If you like any of the cards played throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Higher tier patrons get access to a VIP section of my Discord server, as well as early access to scheduled videos on YouTube. You can find a link to that down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Josué keeps an opening hand of Urza's Mine, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, Gilded Lotus, Seagate Wreckage, Soul Ring, and Eldrazi Mimic. Stephan keeps an opening hand of Dread Wanderer, Murderous Rider, Lord of the Accursed, Living Death, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and Fabled Passage. I keep an opening hand of Havangul Lich, Intuition, Mortuary, Cross and Restorer, Dryad Arbor, Breeding Pool, and Sequester Stash. Josué wins the die roll and starts us off. Josué draws a card, then plays an Urza's Mine. He taps it to cast Soul Ring. He taps that to cast an Eldrazi Mimic. Suffice it to say that Josué had a very scary first turn. He then passes. Stephan draws a card, plays a Fabled Passage, then passes as he searches for a basic swamp. I draw a card, play a Dryad Arbor, then pass. Josué untaps, then draws a card. He plays an Emergence Zone. He then enters combat, sending the Mimic to Stephan, who can't block. He then passes. Stephan untaps, then draws a card. He plays an Isolated Chapel. He then casts his own Soul Ring. He taps that to cast Arcane Signet. He then taps it to cast Dread Wanderer. He then passes. I draw a card. I play a Marsh Flats, immediately activating it to fetch for an Underground Sea. I then tap out to cast Kiora's Follower. I then pass. Josué untaps, then draws a card. He plays a Tomb of the Spirit Dragon. He then taps out to cast a Gilded Lotus. He then passes. Stephan untaps, then draws a card. He taps out to cast Liliana Death's Majesty. He activates her first ability, self-milling 2 and creating a 2/2 black zombie token. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play a tapped Breeding Pool. I then tap out to cast Cross and Restorer. I then pass. Josué untaps, then draws a card. He plays an Eldrazi Temple. He then taps out to cast his commander, drawing him back to a hand of 7 cards. When it enters the battlefield, the Mimic becomes a 12/12 until end of turn. He then enters combat, sending it once more towards Stephan, who chooses to block it with the Wanderer, which dies after combat. He then passes. Stephan untaps, then draws a card. He plays an Underground River. He then casts Swift End, targeting Kozilek. Kozilek dies, Stephan loses 2 life, and Murderous Rider goes on an adventure. He activates Liliana's first ability, self-milling 2 and creating a 2/2 black zombie creature token. He then casts Lord of the Accursed. He enters combat, attacking Josué with the zombie token. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play Sequester Stash. I then cast my commander. When she enters the battlefield, I self-mill 3 cards. Her triggered ability triggers, so I create a 2/2 black zombie creature token of my own. I then pass. Josué untaps, then draws a card. He plays Seagate Wreckage. He casts Mana Vault. He then casts Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, targeting Liliana. When it enters the battlefield, the Mimic becomes a 10/10 until end of turn. He then enters combat, sending it towards Stephan, who chooses to block it with the Lord. Josué then passes. Stephan untaps, then draws a card. He enters combat, sending both zombie tokens towards Josué, who doesn't block any of them, taking 4 combat damage. He casts Azorius Signet. He then taps out to cast Living Death, which bypasses Ulamog's indestructibility. Setting me back immensely by getting rid of my mana dorks, everyone swaps out the creatures in their graveyard for the creatures on their battlefield. Stephan's creatures return, as well as Gravedigger previously milled by Liliana. I get my previously self-milled the Scarab God reanimated for my troubles. Josué's graveyard should have been shuffled into his library due to Ulamog's trigger. Fortunately, we correct this mistake later on. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play an untapped Overgrown Tomb. I then pass. Josué untaps, he pays to untap Mana Vault during his upkeep. He then draws a card. He then casts Conduit of Ruin, searching for Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger to put on top of his library. He then passes. Stephan untaps, then draws a card. He casts his commander. Stephan offers me a deal before entering combat. He wants to draw cards in order to dig for a response to Ulamog, but doesn't want his lord to get chump blocked. I agree on the condition that he chooses as I say for the next spell I cast. He accepts, so he enters combat, assigning the lord to me and the other 2 zombies to Josué. Varina triggers, so Stephan gains 3 life and loots 3 cards. Josué blocks the Gravedigger with his Conduit and I don't block. I take 2 combat damage, Josué takes 3 combat damage, and the Gravedigger dies. Afterwards, he casts Murderous Rider from exile. At the end of Stephan's turn, I cast Intuition. I search for 3 cards and show them to Stephan. True to his word, Stephan chooses what I wanted him to choose and I put it in my hand, while the other 2 go to my graveyard. I then start my turn untapping my lands, then drawing a card. I play Minamo School at Water's Edge. I then cast Mesmeric Orb, which is the card I tutored up with Intuition thanks to Stephan. Thanks to this, Ulamog will be milled from the top of Josué's library during his untap step. I then cast Apheto Alchemist. 2/3 there with my infinite combo assembled, I pass the turn. Josué untaps, causing him to mill 7 cards. He then draws a card. He casts Ulamog's Crusher. Then he casts Staff of Nin. He then passes. Stephan untaps, causing him to mill 8 cards. He then draws a card. He casts Undead Augur. He enters combat, sending the Wanderer to Josué. Varina triggers, gaining him 1 life and looting him for 1. Josué blocks, killing the Wanderer. Its death triggers the Augur, so Stephan draws a card and loses 1 life. He then plays an untapped Watery Grave. He casts Eternal Taskmaster. He then passes. I untap, self-milling 4 cards. I then draw a card. Unable to cast Sidisi to complete my infinite combo, I instead opt to eternalize Ulamog from Josué's graveyard with the Scarab God. I then pass. Josué untaps, milling 6. In his upkeep, he draws 1 from the staff. He pays to untap Mana Vault, milling yet another card. He then draws in his draw step. He casts Burnish Heart. He then enters combat, sending both eldrazi to Stephan, triggering Annihilator. Stephan sacrifices the Rider and the Augur, which trigger the Augur. He draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. The Rider should have gone to the bottom of his library, but we corrected that later on in the match. He blocks the conduit with Varina, and in response he activates her twice to create 2 tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. Both creatures die at the end of combat. Josué then passes. Stephan untaps, milling 10 cards. He then draws a card. He recasts his commander. He enters combat, sending 3 zombies to Josué, triggering Varina. He gains 3 life and loots for 3. Josué blocks the Taskmaster with his Elk. In response, he sacrifices it to ramp for 2 wastes. He then takes 5 combat damage. Stephan plays an Addarkar Wastes. He casts a Dimir Signet. He then passes. I untap, then self-mill 4 cards. I miss the Scarab God's upkeep trigger, and then draw. I think a bit and then pass. Josué untaps and has to mill 10 cards. However, he mills Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. In response to its trigger, I eternalize it with the Scarab God. The trigger resolves, so he shuffles his graveyard back into his library. Then he mills the remaining cards. He then draws 2 cards. He recasts his commander, drawing up to 7. He plays a waste. He then casts Lightning Greaves and equips it to Kozilek afterwards. He enters combat, sending both eldrazi to Stephan. Stephan sacrifices to the Annihilator trigger. He blocks Kozilek but takes 8 combat damage from the Crusher. He then passes. Stephan untaps and has to mill 8 cards. He then draws a card. He casts Sidisi Undead Vizier, exploiting a zombie token when she enters the battlefield. He looks through his library for a card and puts it into his hand. He casts Gravecrawler from his graveyard. He then casts Stronghold Assassin, but Josué discards an unstable monolith in order to counter it with Kozilek. Stephan passes. I untap, self-mill 4 cards. The Scarab God triggers in my upkeep, so my opponents lose 2 life and I scry 2. I then draw a card. I cast Mana Crypt. I think about Kozilek being able to counter my spells, so I don't risk casting Sidisi in order to lose my mana. I decide to keep mana open for the Scarab God's ability instead, and then pass. Josué untaps and mills 12 cards. He then draws 2 cards. He casts Reality Smasher. He enters combat and sends everything to Stephan. He sacrifices his signets to the Annihilator trigger. Stephan blocks with Sidisi and Gravecrawler. He shouldn't have been able to, but we fixed that later on in the match. Additionally, Sidisi has Death Touch, so the Smasher would have died in combat as well. So I'm going to go with 2 wrongs make a right in this case. Correcting for errors, Stephan takes 17 combat damage. Josué then passes. Stephan untaps, then mills 7 cards. He then draws a card. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. I respond by eternalizing Frilled Mystic from my graveyard. When its token enters the battlefield, I counter the Cyclonic Rift. He then recasts Gravecrawler from his graveyard. Keep in mind though that he shouldn't have been able to cast it because it should have still been on the battlefield. So at least it corrected itself. What shouldn't be on the battlefield is his Sidisi and Josué's Crusher because that's how the block should have been in combat, which is how he corrected Stephan's mistake. Stephan then passes. At the end of his turn, I untap Mana Crypt with a Fatal Alchemist. That triggers the orb, so I mill 1. I eternalize Clever Impersonator with the Scarab God, having that token copy enter the battlefield as a copy of Kozilek. I then begin my turn. I untap and then self-mill 6. During my upkeep, the Scarab God triggers, so my opponents each lose 4 life and I scry 4. This eliminates Stephan from the game. Mana Crypt triggers and I lose the coin flip. I then draw a card. I tap Mana Crypt for 2 and then untap it with the Alchemist, triggering the orb for 1, and tap it again for 4 colorless mana. I use that and a land to cast Body Double, entering as a copy of Craterhoof Behemoth. When it enters the battlefield, my creatures get +7/+7 and trample until end of turn. Facing down inevitable defeat, Josué acknowledges the eventual loss to combat damage and concedes the game. Although Stephan made the mistake of blocking with the Gravecrawler that final turn, it wasn't really going to matter because I had Craterhoof Behemoth in my graveyard, so I was going to win that turn anyways. I knew the end was near and missed some Mesmeric Orb triggers, but I corrected them later on. Fortunately, none of these mistakes affected the outcome of the game. In my final turn, I risked casting Body Double because Kozilek could have countered it. However, had he, I had the mana left over to eternalize it from my graveyard afterwards and had it become Craterhoof Behemoth anyways. I played it safe and it paid off. The all-star of this match was definitely Mesmeric Orb. It helped my deck basically be a Soul Tie Scarab God. However, before continuing with my usual post-game analysis, for this episode of the stage I want to do something different. I'm going to suggest you go check out this episode of the Command Palace podcast. This fledgling podcast was started by Saul, Stephan, and Josué a couple of months ago. They invited me over to discuss the game with them. So at least for this episode, you can hear the post-game analysis by all 3 players involved instead of just myself. Also, it'd be great if you can check out their content as well. It's a podcast dedicated to the Commander format, naturally. So if you like that kind of discussion, give them a listen. For us, this was a really long game, but we had a blast playing this game and I hope you had fun watching it. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. It also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Stage on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy playing.